As we continue our series in the book of Job, we are going to pick up in the 13th verse of the 39th chapter. And I hope we all have enjoyed this time in looking at God's animate nature and God's inanimate nature. And I must admit, this week in particular, I had some fun considering the ostrich and the horse. So we'll begin with an ostrich. Now, when I was little, I had a terrifying moment with an ostrich. I was taken to one of those animal farms, and I was able to pet an ostrich. But if you get close to these guys, they're unpredictable and they're somewhat scary, and they have that crazy look in their eye. I just can't trust an ostrich. So I'm not the biggest fans of them. And by God's grace, we actually held this to this week. If I would have given this message last week, the ostrich wouldn't have fared all that well, to be honest. So, I did learn some things, changed my perspective somewhat. But without further ado, we must dig into the text, because as we conclude this chapter, the conclusion of this chapter reflects, and I think purposefully, something that Jesus says about when he returns, the end of the age, and so on. So we want to spend some time, because I think he purposefully does that as we transition into God's final series of questioning. Once this is concluded, God addresses Job again, and that's apparently not enough. God's not done with Job just yet, but this is the transition point, and we must make something of a point of that. But first, so beginning again in verse 13, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly stork's. So the wings of the ostrich, they kind of look like a stork's. If you see a stork, but their wings are actually much clearer. They're, in my opinion, a little more beautiful. I mean, they're black and white, but in my opinion, they're more beautiful. The ostrich will wave their wings for a variety of reasons, but this is really talking about when they're in a full sprint. And just so you know, the ostrich can run up to 43 miles an hour. So it's the largest and the heaviest bird in all the world. Obviously, it cannot fly, but it's also, again, the fastest. 43 miles an hour is doing some moving. Okay, but so that's one time they'll actually wave their wings, and another time is while the hen is protecting her chicks. Well, really the eggs before they even hatch. And as we go along, we will see this. Now, before we even get into this, we need to kind of set up the scene here. The male ostrich, it could be called a cock or a rooster as well, in their baby ostriches are chicks as well. But the male will obviously be the predominant one, but he'll have something of a harem of wives, so to speak, of ostrich hens. But he'll have like his primary one. He'll have like his wife and then his concubines. And his wife is really the alpha of all the hens. And so that's just important to set up as we move along. But this first verse is comparing the pride of the ostrich while they're, again, in full sprint and so forth. Now, again, what we want to do is recognize that God isn't saying that the ostrich is actually being boastful when he's flapping his wings and so forth. What he's doing here is illustrating how this appears to man. Okay, so again, that's another important point as we go along and as we consider the horse and the eagle and the hawk and so on. So, verse 14, for she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets them. She forgets that a foot may crush them or that a wild beast may break them. Okay, so she'll lay the eggs in a very warm place in the sand, and if the hens also have eggs as well, they will be part of that group of eggs. However, the mother hen, the main hen, will put hers in the middle, and then the ones on the outskirts are basically in case the jackals come. If you read in the Bible, they talk, even Job brought up, being in the presence of the ostrich and the jackals. He's a brother of ostriches, and he's surrounded by jackals. So the jackal will come and ultimately looking for these eggs. They're full of nutrients. And so she'll kind of skirt one out of the other, of the harem, and they will get their eggs. So it's true that the mother hen, the main hen, will leave the eggs for a time, but then the other hens would come and lay on the eggs. Okay, now briefly, real quickly, because again, to us, the ostrich in Arabic terms, they're actually called the impious bird, whereas the stork is called a pious bird, because again, according to mankind, according to what we see, it looks like the ostrich hen doesn't care for her young. She just gets up and leaves. But we must understand, especially in the heat, when the sun is at its hottest, I mean, that would be sufficient in incubating these eggs as well. But again, other hens would come and lay on them as well. But again, from our perception, it seems like it's an impious bird, not caring for her young at all. Now, I think this is also getting into the Christian, the believer, who cares not for their sons and daughters. Ultimately, they care more about how their sons and daughters and what they want and what they enjoy and so forth, rather than their eternal security, rather than their eternal good and their salvation and their sanctification and so on. This is what the mother and the father should be trying to instill into their children, much less leaving them and so forth, much more feeding them with the word of God. 16, she treats her young harshly as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. Okay. So again, what God is telling us here is that from our perspective, the ostrich looks rather foolish. And again, I can vouch for this myself. They've got that crazy look in their eye. They're absolutely, you don't know what to expect with the ostrich. I mean, they'll run full sprint into a wall and kill themselves. They'll do all sorts of craziness. But so again, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. Many people have come to try to vindicate the ostrich, suggesting there is no such thing as an inherently dumb or unwise animal. And I think that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, if God creates an animal and chooses not to give them wisdom, so what? So what? And I think what God is suggesting to Job here too is, seems like you're lacking some understanding as well. I gave you understanding, but you have lacked understanding throughout your series of questions. So because God, she treats her young harshly as though they were not hers. Again, this is what it looks like to us. That's not true. That's not true. God has actually created them with this instinct where the main hen will depart for a time and then the harem will come and take over for her and so on. But again, from what it looks like to us, it looks like she's an impious bird who cares not for her kids, because even when they're born, these hens are always around these chicks. Like the father will go off, and the father is very protective though. He's always looking up. He's always checking, and they can see very far off. So he's kind of the protector with sight. The hens are always around the chicks. They do care for their young, but again, from what we see, it doesn't seem like it. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. So again, she's flapping them proudly, but she cannot fly. She scorns the horse, and this is a transition, obviously. She scorns the horse and his rider, the horse's rider. Essentially, the horse is, again, the only one that can be domesticated and controlled, so to speak, by a rider, unlike any of the animals we've seen thus far. And I wouldn't ride an ostrich, so I'm glad they scorn the horse and its rider. I'm not getting on an ostrich. I think that's insane. Because they're unwily, they're unpredictable, they're just kind of crazy. But when she lifts herself on high is an interesting, I think this has a hint of humor here. She's lifting herself on high. Now the neck of an ostrich, obviously, they can reach about 8 feet tall. They can be about 8 feet tall. So it's either when she lifts her neck to her utmost height, Or when she's flapping her wings proudly, I think that's exactly what it goes to, because that's what it begins with. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, and she goes nowhere. She cannot fly, and she scorns the horse because, again, this horse is very strong, but this horse is controlled by a rider, and the pride, as it appears to us, of the ostrich would not allow such a thing. And that's what we're going to say about the ostrich. There's much to say about this, and God willing, we will return to this and break this down much more succinctly and more comprehensively. But we must move on. Again, we're not expositing each verse here. Verse 19, have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Now, I studied up on war horses, and I love the horse. It's amazing how they can train these horses to do many things. But God is ultimately saying, have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Now, the thunder, this is a beautiful picture of the mane of the horse when he's riding, and it's shaking and it's quivering and it's vibrating and it looks like thunder. And he uses thunder again. So he begins with the mane of the horse being akin to thunder. It's a powerful image, but who gave the horse its strength? And who gave the horse this submission to be controlled by mankind, even in the midst of warfare, even in the midst of the most harsh battle, which is exactly what he's going to get into. Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. So can you frighten him like a locust? The locust in the East and in many areas, many people saw that as like a little horse. So even in other languages, the name for a locust will be little horse. And so basically God's saying, can you frighten a horse like you can a locust? Horses seem fearless because, again, God gave them this instinct to merely do that which the rider has trained them to do. So they don't get shaken by the touch of the quiver, as he will say, or the spear, the javelin, and so forth, or the lance, and so on, because he's just doing what his master has trained him to do. And they have all sorts of different ways in which when you go into the infantry. So you got the cavalry, obviously those are the ones on the horses, who I would much rather be, but they can train their horses to either bump, so kind of throw their legs up in the front to clear way, and in the back. So, you're in the midst of the battle, and they're also able to function in a way to make it easier for the rider to fight, and also to clear the way to get out of there and move into another area. So there are many tactical ways by which this is done, but can you frighten a horse? A horse will run straight into the midst of a battle and so on. Can you frighten a horse? I love this. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He gallops in the clash of arms. He mocks at fear and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. So he paws in the valley. Let's remember this vision. The valley is essentially where the battle takes place. But he will talk about when he's running, it's almost like he's kicking up the dirt to swallow it. It's swallowing the ground. So as he's pawing the valley here, it's similar to that same imagery, which we will see as we go along. But he paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. Again, this is what it looks like to us, but the horse is just being a horse. This is the nature that God has given them. But he's illustrating it in such a way as how we see it. I love the horse. Compared to the ostrich, horse. Give me a horse 1,000 times out of 1,000 rather than an ostrich. So again, though, he mocks at fear and is not frightened. He does not mock at fear. It seems like he mocks at fear, and we will continue to see this. The quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and javelin. The javelin is really the lance. And you've seen these jousts with the knights and so forth, these huge, long, and thick lance. In the battlefield and in warfare, it would be a thinner situation, much easier to control, and it doesn't take all the room in the world, and you can have that and a sword and arrows and so forth. But this is just saying, as the horse is in the midst of the battle, even the quiver, the quiver, which holds the arrows and so forth, rattles against him. The glittering spear and javelin, all these weapons are pressing against him. He's feeling it, and he doesn't care because he's trained to do what the rider has trained him to do. He devours the distance with fierceness and rage, nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sounded. So he devours the distance with fierceness and rage. This is what it looks like to us. When the rider is riding in valiantly and courageously, it looks like the horse is full of the same emotions as his rider, because he is trained to do this. We need to understand and appreciate the fact and embrace the fact that this is an illustration of how we see it, not as how the horse actually is. The horse has no courage, so the only way. Jordan Peterson talks about how a real man, ought to be dangerous. If a man isn't dangerous, it's not really worth anything if he doesn't exercise that danger. In other words, if he poses no threat whatsoever, being passive and not engaging in the battle at all isn't valiant, isn't courageous. You're only courageous if you have fear and you overcome it. The horse has no fear because he's not created that way. We are created to have fear, and thus we are also created to have courage. Nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sounded. This is the war trumpet. This is a ram's horn. At the blast of the trumpet, he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of captains and shouting. So at the blast of the trumpet, again, this is the war trumpet. He says, "Aha!" Like God is again picturing us. For us, the horse is getting excited. He hears the trumpet sound, he hears the blast of the trumpet, and he smells the battle far off. He's ready. He can't see it. He hears the trumpet and he's ready to go. And at that, he smells the battle from afar and the thunder of captains and shouting. So again, remember, it begins with the thunder as his main, and also he is ready and excited to go into the battle of the thunder of captains and of shouting. We've spoken of this fairly briefly when we were looking at David and Goliath, how before a battle emerges, each side is yelling at the other and pumping each other up and so forth. I mean, we do this in sports. Again, when I was in football, this is what we do very often. Try to pump each other up and hit each other. Some insane reason, but it does work. It does work, and you're pressed forward. You're encouraged and you're strengthened for the battle or the game ahead. Going on to the hawk and the eagle. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? The migration of birds, I find fascinating. The eagle is the one who really is the first one to go. The hawk is, which is kind of an interesting situation. But I find migration, if we see the cycles of different kind of animals, they are spectacular. Again, one of the things I spoke about last week is that my wife Sarah and I like to sit outside, and one of the things we've noticed is every year in the springtime we have seemingly the same cardinals that come to our house, and they kind of nest in our tree and visit from time to time. But they'll come and they kind of make their home here, but they'll fly off. I guess not here, but at our house, they'll in our backyard. But they'll fly to the south for the warm weather, just as every bird does, and then they find this place that they've decided to call home for one reason or another. The salmon, throughout their lifespan, I think it's 5 to 10 years, but they'll go through all sorts of different waters and then ultimately end up where they left in the first place, to die there. How? How and why? God has made these this way. It's an amazing thing that they are just instinctively able to do this by how God has created them. But the migration of birds I find fascinating. Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high? So the eagle is called the bird of heaven because they are the ones who fly the highest in the air. I love the hawk and I love the eagle. I think they're beautiful animals. And in our last house, we had like a pet hawk and a pet eagle. Get visited from them every once in a while. I remember, I told this story, but I remember a hawk coming and perching right next to me as I was working in the backyard, and they're huge and they're frightening. And so, I just wanted to make sure everything was good, before I continued. And he just sat there and we hung out for a while. But so the eagle, though, again, is called the bird of heaven because he goes higher than any other bird, and he actually shelters higher than any bird, which he goes on. On the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock in the stronghold. I wanted to give you a couple of parts in which the scriptures go into the eagle. Here we go. Yeah. So this is Jeremiah 49, verse 16. Your fierceness has deceived you, the pride of your heart. He's talking about Edom here. O you who dwell in the clefts of the rock, who hold the height of the hill, though you make your nest as high as the eagle, I will bring you down from there, says the Lord. Then I saw, this is Revelation 19, verses 17 and 18. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in the midst of the heaven, come and gather together for the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, and of those who sat on them, and the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. And we will get more into that as we, again, conclude this portion. But again, he dwells on the cleft of the rock. On the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock and on the stronghold. So the crag of the rock is really like those little lips. There's like these little crevices that they'll latch onto with their claws. I don't know what you call them, actually. Talons. Exactly. Thank you, Sarah. From there it spies out the prey. Its eyes observe from afar. This is one of the fascinating things about the eagle. This is one of the beasts of prey, essentially, that doesn't hunt their animals by smell or even by hearing. The hawk can be way high in the heavens and spot his prey. The eagle's eye is fascinating, and that's what he's saying here. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. In Matthew, I think it's chapter 28, but he goes into what it's going to be like at the end of the age. So at first, the Pharisees asked Jesus, when will these things be? And Jesus goes through a full discourse that I very much encourage you to read. This can also be found in Luke chapter 17, and this is the one we're going to consider. But so the Pharisees first ask, when will these things be? And Jesus says, one of the things is there will be wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. I just want to make that clear because everybody makes a big deal out of wars and rumors of wars. And he even says, but the end is not yet. These are birth pangs, as it were, before his second coming. He talks about two men in the field. One will be taken, the other left. Two women in the field. One will be taken, the other left. And towards the end of that discourse, the disciples ask him, where will these things be, Lord? And that is where he says in Luke 17, verse 37, and they answered and said to him, where, Lord? I'm sorry. So he said to them, wherever the body is, Matthew says, wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Briefly, eagles don't typically eat carrion. This is, again, the flesh of dead animals and so on, but they will from time to time. And the ones in the Middle East do, and so there are some that do. Jesus is painting a fairly gloomy picture of his return. These birth pangs are going to intensify. These wars will become more severe and even worse. So as terrible as World War I was, the Great War, as terrible as World War II was, we haven't seen anything yet. We haven't seen anything yet. And ultimately, when he comes, where will these things be? When he talks about one will be taken and the other left, where will it be? Disciples, this is what you're asking me, even after I told you repeatedly, the day and hour I do not know. So that's a when question, but now they're asking a where question. And he says, wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Essentially, wherever the dead is, wherever the dead are, they are. When he comes again, when he came, this is what I was trying to allude to in our last week message. Jesus is the Son of God, and he is absolutely awesome. He is full of grace and mercy and compassion, no doubt about it. His love for his people is unwavering and eternal, and so sweet and so sincere and so dear. The other side of that equation is those who despise him. When he returns, that will be the end of any hope whatsoever. Where will these things be, Lord? Well, where will you be? You'll be with me in the Shekinah glory. But you will look down and you will see these carcasses filling the earth, much like after the flood. Much like after the flood, the judgment will come. Some will be left to be fed, just as in Revelation, where it says that then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in the midst of the heaven, come and gather together for the supper of the great God. Now this is the supper for the birds, that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, who they used, and of those in the battles. Okay, now this is obviously somewhat symbolic, but the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, and of those who sat on them, and the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. Remember, we've seen through all the epistles, he talks about there's no difference between slave or free in salvation. Even if you're a slave, you are free in Christ. And if you are a free man and not in Christ, you're a slave. So this is saying, though, they will eat both of the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. There is no distinction between the great and the small, or the great and the not so great, or the slave or free in salvation, and there's no distinction in condemnation. When the Son of Man comes, he will come on his cloud of glory, and it will be a day of great rejoicing, even and because of when we see that where the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. I know it's hard to imagine, and I caution anyone to do so, but because we do not and we must not rejoice at the condemnation of anyone, or anybody's eternal destruction and their eternal separation from God. But we must always understand and embrace when that day comes and the full wrath of God is poured out, that day will be when his justice is at last fully poured out. For the sheep on his right hand to enter into everlasting glory, into the light of the Lamb. For the goats on the left to the outer darkness, to the outermost darkness, where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. But that great divide is because of the judgment, the just judgment of God. So as we conclude and as we move into the concluding questions that God has for Job, I think this is why Christ uses this verse, almost telling me anyway, in this book of Job, this is a transition point. This is the end time of this conversation. Now we're going to consider Behemoth and Leviathan, and we will get into that next week. But there's a transition point. There's something that is concluded, that is ultimately and absolutely done now with this series of questions. But God has some more. God has additional messages, not really connected, in my opinion, as much as everything else we've seen was connected to another, or were connected to another. But Christ here is illustrating, again, first of all for Job, this transition, but for us also that transition. The coming of the Son of Man, the parousia. Yes, we long for it, and yes, we must always keep on watch for him, his return. But let us realize and remember what he actually says to them, and what he says to the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Again, oracles of woe upon men and women. You know, we have this image of Jesus, and again, he's a very gentle, again though, just like C.S. Lewis said, he's a good lion. He is, he's a good lion, altogether good, perfect. But he cannot be tamed. He is not a tame lion. He's a good lion, but he's a dangerous lion. That's what we were getting at. If there's no ability to danger, if there is no judgment, if there are no carcasses, what is salvation? What does it matter? What's the difference? What's the point? If there is no outer darkness, then there is no light of the Lamb. He came to judge the earth. He came to open the eyes of the blind, but those who say they see, to shut their eyes forever. Now, as we do finally conclude this chapter of the 39th chapter of the book of Job, we'll transition, and I'm going to give you I'll give you a glimpse as to what other people think about this Behemoth and Leviathan, but I'm going to give you some of my own conjecture regarding that, which this is a topic of which many theologians disagree. I do think it goes into evil, and so that's kind of your glimpse into that. And then at last we'll see Job being restored, and then we'll consider what James had to say about Job, God willing, in the next 2 to 3 weeks. All right, praise God. Let's pray.